Hi, everyone, and welcome back. First of all, I'd like to apologize that I'm not going to be posting as many videos going forward, at least for some time, because I've actually found a partner to work on my game with me, and I'm busy working on assets for my robot junkyard game. And what I've decided to do is, as I find things that I come across as I'm making assets that I think might make a good lesson, I'm just going to go ahead and make videos of those. So they're not going to be posted quite as regularly. It's just going to be as I come up with stuff. But I'm hoping that you'll find these things useful. And today, what we're going to do is we've got this battery, which gives juice to the player. The player is a little robot, and you got to get juiced up. You run out of juice, and you got to find these battery spots, amongst other things. And it's going to have, like an emissive, and it provides you with energy. And we've got this battery charge level because as it runs out of battery, this bit you're going to have to see in the player, but there's an animation there. It flashes for the last bit of it, and then once you go above 0.25, it starts to change color, and it goes from red to green. And while it's doing that, there's also this little dial at the bottom that moves back and forth. So to see it in the play, I kind of wanted you to see the whole thing first, because if we send this material to the player, I haven't figured out a way of getting this player to show more than one material. So I want to show you how, if you just want to look at one material, you can click off the ones that you don't want to see. We're actually looking at this one, and touch it again, and it will just show you the material you're looking at. I haven't figured out a way. I really spent a good deal of time. It's like you've got this drop down list, but you've only got the one thing here, and I've been fooling around with it, and I can't figure it out. If anybody can, I would love to know how to do that. But I wanted to show you what the animation actually does. So all these other materials are static, so I've kept them separate, and I've got just this very small animation, so it runs good. I'm going to set the timeline going, and that's that battery charge level that we were looking at. Now here, if it's at 0, it's going to give me a steady state. But if it's anywhere between 0 and 0.25, it's going to flash. And that's the part that was just showing black when we were looking at it originally. And then as you go up, it changes color, and that dial is doing its thing. So we're going to take a look at how to get there's two things going on here. There's this color change is one set of functions, or it's one function, and then this is another function. And if we go back to substance, the way I have it set up for my material, because this is actually combined with, these giant things here, right? So this is all my static stuff. I've got a couple of materials with static, and that's the one here. And then, so I've moved the animation, anything with functions in it, anything that's actually procedural, I've moved to this very small material. So it's a very lightweight material because these things are going to get instanced. There's more than one of these batteries. So, every time it gets instanced, it's only having to make different instances of these very small materials. And the way I have it set up here, I have the dial nested into the color, and I spit it out as one material. When we make this, we're just going to make it one big material, because this is not very big. If we open this reference, this is the dial. So we're just going to plonk this into, one thing, because you don't have to fit it into other stuff the way I do. We're just going to look at the functions. So that was a long preamble, and let's make our new substance. So we're going to get a new substance. We're going to call this dial, and there we go. Okay, we're going to start with the dial, and you know what, let's get our scene back to a cube, because we're just doing our own thing here, and we're not actually working on my battery anymore. And we're going to start with the dial. Now, I happen to have a selection of arrows that I just made in Photoshop, because I use these, but the shape isn't quite what I want it here. So again, you're going to have your own assets that you're dealing with here. So obviously what I'm doing here is a suggestion. So the first thing I want to do is I want to take this arrow that I've had in my assets and just make it work for this particular situation. So I'm going to get a transform 2D node, and I want it to be oriented vertically, not horizontally. So we're going to do that, and we're going to orient it like that. And then I wasn't really happy with the size that I had, so I changed that as well. And I'm just going to enter in the matrix values that I have. I fooled around with it. I squished it and I squashed it and I did things with it, but I ended up with this. It's the negative here is what flipped it vertically. So I have videos on how this matrix actually works, so I'm not going to go into it now, but if you want to do things that are more than just 90-degree turns and more complicated, you can always just switch edit matrix values. It gives you the actual float fours that you can manipulate with functions, etc. back here. But we've got a problem. Obviously it's tiling and we want it to not do that. So we have to come in here and change this to absolute and no tiling. And this way it's just going to give us the one arrow, the size and shape that we wanted. So all of this was just to get this shape that I'm now going to be using as the basis for my gauge. And then the other thing that I had in my original was I had kind of like this base that it goes around, and for that I got the regular shape node and I got the disk, and again we're going to get a transform 2D, and I'm just going to put in the numbers that I had, and we need to make it stop tiling, and we need to move it into the position that we want it moved into. And that I had set the y at negative 0.6811. The other thing I want to have happen is I want this to be small. I don't need this. This is a mask, and I'm going to bring this down to match this guy at 512. Now you'll notice these bitmaps, no matter how big I make this bitmap, it's going to calculate at 0 milliseconds, and that's because there's no there's nothing procedural about it. Whereas here in the shape, there's procedural stuff going on, and making it smaller actually does make a difference. Okay, now we get to the nitty-gritty of it. For this, we are going to use the pixel processor, because what we need to do here is we need to take this image and we need to rotate it around. And the effects node doesn't really do that for us in the way that we need to do it, because we need to be able to move the pivot point to where we want it. So for something like this, we really want to use the pixel processor. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to change this to a grayscale output, because we're not going to need a color output, and that makes a big difference in how it gets processed. And we're going to plug in our shape. And instead of right-clicking on Pixel Processor, we come in here and we're going to click Edit Per Pixel Function. And right now, it's giving us a float 4, which is essentially black. It's 0, 0, 0, 0, and then 1 for the opacity. So now we have to come up with a function that's going to produce an image, because right now we've got something plugged in here, and it's not even showing us the image we've got plugged in here. So the Pixel Processor works a little bit differently from the effects node, and the main thing that's different, if you'll see here, you're going to get this thing here called samplers, which you're only going to find in the pixel processor. And I don't know enough technically exactly what's going on, but this is the thing that is actually sampling the per pixel in the per pixel function. So you actually have to look at each individual pixel, and that's what these samplers do. So we're going to get a sample gray because our output is going to be grayscale. And when all is said and done, this will always be our output node. This is always going to get set as our output node. It's still giving us nothing, because we've got nothing plugged in there. Now we have to do something that's going to actually feed into this sampler. Now, the other thing that we're always going to use with a pixel processor is $ position, because you need to be talking about a position of a particular pixel, and that's what we're doing here. We're manipulating pixels. So at any given point, we have to talk about its position. And since we're going to be rotating, I'm going to come into the library here, and I'm going to get rotate. Rotate vector 2 is what I want. So that position is my vector 2. And then I've got a couple of other things here. I've got an angle, and I've got a pivot. So the angle is the turn. I mean, that's, you know, if we put a time on here, it would just like spin around and round and round if we put a $ time. What we're going to do is we're going to create a variable, our battery charge variable, and that's going to change that angle. This pivot point is telling you, like, what is the pivot point that turn is happening on. So those are the two things, and this is just to analyze any given pixel at any given point. So we're going to plug that in there. Now we just have to come up with some math. What we forgot to do before was actually create that variable that we're going to be basing all of this off of. So I'm coming back to my main graph, and we're going to come in here, and we're going to create an input parameter. And we'll call this battery charge, and it's a float 1. And we're going to keep it at the default, because it's going to go from 0 to 1. Right, so let's get back to our pixel processor, and now we can grab up that variable. So let's just take a look at what happens if we plug this in here. Let's just get a float 2 for now. We'll plug that in there, and all of a sudden we can see our little thing. And I'm going to go ahead and plug that into my color view outputs in 3D view, and we can see it on our 3D view now. So if I come into my variable and I start moving this around, it's spinning around. It's just not doing it in a way that we want, because the pivot point is up here at 0, 0, and it's pivoting around that 0, 0 point. And if I start changing this number around, the pivot point's like down here now. It's not quite as drastic as I wanted it to be, but you can see that the point at which it's pivoting around is changing. So that's what we've got to take care of with our function. The other thing, if we think about our gauge, it's like we don't want a full circle. We only want it to go basically halfway through, right? We don't want it to go all the way around once we figure out what our pivot point is. In fact, let's do that first, okay? Because it's probably easier to imagine. I want to look at, it's the ones I've already made. Let's not get confused there. I want to have these two together because I'm kind of making this base for it. I mean, it's just aesthetic, so we might as well do it that way. I'm going to get a blend node. Let's use a lighten blend for these. Oh, that's not a lighten, that's a darken. That explains that. Okay, I think I actually want this a little bit smaller and lower. Okay, so we want to fix it so that our pivot point is like somewhere here. So that's about 0.5 and 0. I always get mixed up with this stuff. Let's fool around with it a little bit. So I'm thinking it's, I'm just going to plug in what I had come up with when I did this originally, and let's adjust it to what we've built here. Yeah, so as it comes down here, it's still a little bit too high. I think I'm going to bring this down to, all the way down to 1. I think that'll probably work better. Yeah, the arrow's too big still, but it's the pivot point is in the right spot. Unfortunately, it's the turn, it's not turning where we need it to turn, and that's going to be the other thing that we're going to do in our function. But it's turning at the right spot. So as it goes through, it's pivoting along that arc in a way that makes sense. And what I want to do now is make this whole thing a little bit smaller so that it fits. Well, let's make this smaller first. I'm going to do it on here. I think it'll be just simpler to do it visually rather than through numbers, because it's just an eyeball. So I'm holding down Shift and Alt at the same time, and that's going to keep it at the center. And we're going to have to find a new pivot point, but I think that smaller size is going to work better. And we are going to change this offset. Let's bring this down a little. Oop. I've flipped it, so my X is my Y and my Y is my X right now. There. So I've got my arrow is fitting onto the plane right now. So let's see how that messed up our rotation, our pivot point rather. That's all right. You know, you can fine tune it, but I'm going to call it done for the purposes of this exercise. It's getting a little bit longer as it gets higher, but depending on what you want, it's looking pretty good. Okay, so we got our pivot point squared away, and the problem now is that it's going too far. Well, it's going too far and it's doing it in the wrong place. If you imagine that we move this up to the center and like move the whole thing up to the center so we could see everything that's going on, as I move this forward and it starts going off the page, you can imagine that dial actually working along the other side, and we're just getting it tiled in through here. So we really only want it running for half a turn, and that's the next thing we're going to put in here. So if I want this only going halfway, I'm going to get my multiplication node, I'm going to get a constant 0.5, and I'm going to multiply it. And that's going to give me half a turn. Still doing it in the wrong place, but it's limiting my movement to only half. Now, we're going to do a bit more to this because you'll see what I mean in a minute, but before we add on to the actual turn portion of this function, let's orient it correctly because we're going to need to have it oriented right to really fine-tune, well, to actually have it make a bit more sense. So right now, it's doing half its turn. It's just doing it in the wrong quadrants. And I need to just process it forward. So I'm going to get an addition. I'm going to get another constant. And as it turns out, I want it to move forward by 3/4 of a turn. So I'm going to put in 0.75. And that now orients this whole business the way that we want it. So we can come back in here, and we've got now half a turn. You know, so like 0 to 1 is only dealing with half a turn, but it's now oriented in the place that we want it. Now, I still have an issue with this because I'd like it to kind of not go all the way down. So I'm going to add a little something extra in here. I'm going to get an addition node. I am going to get another float. And I fooled around with these numbers, and I came up with this. Now, you will notice that these two numbers together equal 0.5. So I'm still really only doing half a turn, but I've made it a little bit. I've taken that half turn and I've squished it a little bit. Is essentially what I've done, and it's going to not have it come completely down to the bottom on either edge. So I mean, it's not perfect, but it does the trick, and that's because of specifically my mesh. So that's a little, I mean, that's just to show you that that's something that can be done. But the reason I did it was because in the actual mesh that I was working on, the bottom here is like, if that arrow went all the way down to the bottom, it would like disappear underneath this bar. So I kind of had to move it up a little bit. That's why I did that. Okay, so that is the mechanics of the arrow, and that's the hardest part done. Oh yeah, you know what, the other thing we need to fix, this right here, this is the pixel processor, even if you make it, I think it's got to do with the fact that of the rotations or something, but if you change this to no tiling, it doesn't fix it. And I don't want this other, I'm going to use this as a mask. I don't need this other thing floating around here. So I kind of hacked into it a little bit. I got a vector graphics, you can give it a name, so SVG arrow mask. And I'm going to turn this into a grayscale. And I can actually just apply a quick and dirty mask to this. Right now there's nothing. So the way the SVG node works is you can apply a vector, whether you're doing points or a square or whatever. I think I've also done videos on this, but you double click on the image that you actually want to manipulate. Then you can single click on your SVG, and you've got a bunch of different things that you can do here. I'll either use the shapes tool, or you can use a pen tool if you want to do pen shapes. For this, I'm going to just use this shape, and I'm going to draw a square around this, and that's my foreground, that's my background, and I just made a mask. So in this blend here, that thing on top here has just disappeared. So that's just a quick and dirty way of making a mask for yourself. So that's our arrow. Now we have to make it colored. And for that, I'm going to get a gradient node, and I am going to get a gradient. So I got the gradient linear 1. I want the gradient only falling off on one side, not both sides. So I'll get rid of that one. But I want it oriented differently. I don't think this one orients. I used a transform to do it. Depends on the node. Sometimes, oh yeah, you can rotate it. So I want it 90. You know, I have to use a transform 2D anyway. I'm going to do it the way I had it. You can rotate them in here, but we need to shift it also to the side. So I'm going to get a transform 2D. We'll stick this in here. We'll rotate it 90 degrees counterclockwise like that. I mean, it doesn't really, oh, actually, no, I did it clockwise. And then I got a uniform color. I'm just going to get a white and a blend node. This, again, I'm only just copying the notes that I got here because it's just easier for me to copy this out, but there's no right or wrong way of doing this. This is just, you're just creating a gradient that's going to work for, we're going to use this as a mask. So I'm creating a gradient where I've got red here, yellowish up in here, and green up in here. How you get there really doesn't make a difference. Now, I ended up, oh, I need a mask here. Okay, let's get rid of this for now. What I ended up realizing was that I needed to shift this over on the X, or on the Y because we flipped it, to something like that. Oh, it's tiling also. Let's make it not tile. So that's like completely black. And I want this white because it just worked out with my colors that way. And we're going to need to get another vector graphic to create a mask for this one. So I want this to be pure white at the end. So I'm going to get that white in here. Let's take a look at this here. I'm going to click on my SVG. We're going to get another one of these guys, and I'm going to make a mask that fits over here. So now I've got, that's pure white. If I want to manipulate that, that looks kind of like a hard line. I think I want to move that over a bit. I'm going to grab this one, and I can move this until it just covers that, so I get a nicer gradient. So that I can plug in here now, and we can put in the colors that we want. So here I'm going to go for my red. Here I'm going to go for my green. And I'm going to put another one in here for my yellow. So I get a nice pure yellow. I got the, I mean, again, this is, I'm fine tuning it. I think we probably want to copy this and make a second one here. If you want to get your yellow a little bit, you know, I'm looking at the bands of how that arrow is going to travel through here. Oh, what's going on here? So I'm looking to just try to get that yellow in the middle and the green and the red on either side, whatever it takes to get it to work. There. That looks about right. And we're going to get a blend node. And then this becomes our mask. Oh, you know what? Yeah. This is different from what I've got because I had to fine tune it for my particular material. Let's do this a little bit differently. We're going to get 2 blend nodes here. So we don't really need, this was only, I had a mask because I needed a mask, so you don't even really need this. Let's do the light and blend here. You know, if you need to make a mask for your entire thing, you can do it this way. We're just going to, I guess, create a little color thing here. So let's get a uniform color. I'm making this up now because this is actually different from what I've got. We're just going to try to do a little complete material here. So let's pick a color in here, like blue, maybe gray it down a little bit. So we'll use this as the color for our cover there. And then we can have this cleaned up arrow as the mask for here. And we'll put that underneath our little cover, and we'll put that into our color. So let's see how that works now. So as it goes down, it gets yellower and yellower and yellower, and it gets redder and redder and redder and redder and redder. You know, you can fool around with gradients, and depending on what you want to achieve in your end result, you can just, you're basically creating a color scheme over which you're overlaying this mask that you're moving. And we can make it look a little cooler. We can get let's get the better one. Let's get a height to normal. So we can make a bit of a normal here. Actually, a bevel would be better. Let's do a bevel. So we can create a bevel for this. Plug that into the normal. And then we can adjust that bevel so it doesn't look stupid. Oh, actually, we're going to have to change the color if we want. Oh, I'm getting complicated. That won't take that long. I'm going to make a new mask for the color. We're going to take this height from here. I'm going to run it through levels. And we're going to use that for the mask. And that's going to block out that bevel as well. So, you know, I think we've probably gotten further than I expected to do in this video anyway with this. We don't really need this mask, so I'm going to leave that alone. And that's the first part done. So let's pull that back out here. And the next thing we want to look at is the color change for the light that comes along with this. And I guess we'll make a separate shape to look at that, because again, I had very specific meshes that I was using for that. So we got to invent something for here. Let's get a transform 2D, and we'll just use this disc shape as the thing that we're going to project that color onto, and we're just going to add it to the material. I'm holding down Shift and Alt. I'm just going to make that smaller. Just going to move it up here, and we're going to fix it so that this doesn't tile. Blend node, and we are going to use this as the mask for what we're going to be doing, and then we're going to combine it with what's going on here. Okay, so the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to get a uniform color. Now, in the case of my thing, I actually had a bitmap that had the basic colors for what I was going to, you know, for my actual meshes. I'm going to start with green here, so pure green. So 255, 0, 255, 0, so only 255 in the green channel. Then I'm going to get a hue saturation lightness node, and we're going to plug this in. And what we're going to do is we're going to have that color change happen here on the HSL node. So I've got my hue, and before we actually go and make the function, because it's a pretty simple function, I'm going to explain what we're doing. If we just use the slider the way it is now, I can get the color change I want to happen. So it goes from green to yellow to red. And it does this basically from, it gives me what I want from 0.33 through to 0.5. And it's doing it in the direction I want it to do. So what I really need to do with my function is just get that 0 to 1 slider to translate to 0.33 to 0.5. That's all that needs to happen. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to do empty function. I'm going to get my variable, my battery charge, and then I'm going to do some math on it. I'm going to need a couple of these. I'm going to need a multiplication, and I'm going to need an addition. So the first thing I want to do is I want to shorten the length of, of that slider. And I did the math, and it turns out that I need to multiply this by 0.17. So as this, I'm taking that 0 to 1, and I'm multiplying it by 0.17. So it's making that slider much, much shorter. But then I need to have it start at 0.33. So I'm taking having that little short itty bitty slider begin at 0.33. And that's going to run it between 0.33 and 0.5. So as I do my battery charge, it's at 0, so that means it's at 0.33, and then it's just moving at much smaller increments than it normally would up until it reaches 0.5, at which point it's green again. And I could just take that, plug it in here, and plug this in there, and that will give us our color. So you can add emissives, you can do all the stuff you need to do, you know how to do all that stuff. I just wanted to show you how we can get this to move. So as it moves down, we can make that smaller. I'm getting persnickety with it, so it doesn't overlap. So that's that. The one thing I realize we haven't done yet is the flashy bit at the end. So we can take care of that. And we are going to do that on this same node. To figure out what we want, though, I'm just going to get another one just so we can experiment on it. So we want this to flash, right? So we're going to have it go like that. Now, I'm doing this on the emissive, so I really don't want it to go all the way down to 0. Again, I picked 0.3 as like my darkest thing, but I just want to show you the logic behind the function we're about to build. So it's basically just making it go like this. So whatever it is you want to have happen in here, I tend to figure it out. I figure out the math first here. I look at the numbers that I want to create, and then I just go ahead and make that for my function. So we're going to look at this for a while just to get the flash right, just like this. So I want to start building this by figuring out the flashy bit, and then we're going to plug it into the rest of it. All right, so I need a wave. And we've got our amplitude, and we've got our frequency, and we're going to need a couple of constants for that. I'm going to plug in the numbers that I had. I had 0.2 for the amplitude and 3 for the frequency. So the higher that number is, the quicker it goes. And I don't want them to go into the negative, so I'm going to get an absolute, and this will just keep everything positive. And then, like I said, I didn't want it to go completely to black, and I decided on 0.3 as being the darkest it's going to go. So I'm going to take whatever that wave is happening, I'm going to add that 0.3 to it. And this is just the flashy bit. So I'm going to set this as my output node. And let's publish this out and see how that works. So if I set this going, yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. And that still works. But I mean, we haven't hooked up the two together. So I just wanted to make sure that that flash was what I wanted it to be. So I can come back in here into my lightness. I'm just going to take this, I'm going to copy it, and we're going to bring it into this node that we had already started. So I'm going to come into my lightness. I'm going to create an empty function. I'm just going to paste that in there. I'm going to get rid of this, and I'm going to plug this back in here. All right. So right now, if we have this set up the way it is, it's going to be flashing the whole way through. So we can set this going, and no matter what color we have set in here, it's going to take that color and it's going to flash it. So all we need to do now is just get it so that it stands still when we want it to stand still and flashes when we want it to flash. And for that, we are going to need some if-elses. Again, the order you do this in, I don't know if it's, in this case, makes a difference or not. I'm just going to do it the way I have it. So I started it like this. I decided that if my battery charge is less than or equal to 0.25, then I want it to flash. Otherwise, I set this is 0.5. This is my default brightness. So if this is less than or equal to 0.25, we get the flash. Otherwise, we get this. But I want it to be a steady state when it's at 0. So if it's equal to 0, I also want it to be 0.5. So I think because we're not using it as emissive, let's make this 1. So let's make sure we got this logic right. If it's equal to 0, oh, that's not right. If it's equal to 0, I want it at 1. Otherwise, I want what's going on here to happen. Yeah, okay, that's right. And we'll set this as the output node. Oh, no, it should be 0.5. Oh, because we're talking brightness. That's, okay, I'll show you why it's 0.5. Because it's lightness. If we have this lightness set up, 0.5 is normal here, not 1. Right, so lightness is 0.5. When we set it up to 1, it's white. That's why. All right, an extra one of these. And let's try this now. This should work. So as long as this is over 0.25, it shouldn't flash. The minute it goes under 0.25, it flashes. So that works. And the color is matching whatever we have. And then as it reaches 0, it's steady state. Now we're done. So I hope that's been helpful. Again, I'm going to try to sort of share these little things that I'm coming up with as I do them. I'm working on another one right now. So hopefully sooner rather than later we'll have another animation for you that will be useful, hopefully, in your own work. In the meanwhile, stay safe out there.